So today we are looking at screening, assessment, and motivational interviewing. And so this is a really good session for understanding some of the main tools and techniques for working with how to identify youth who may have been exploited and victimized. And so we're going to look at, firstly, just some tips for motivational interviewing. So what are some tips and tricks for interacting with this population in a healthy way and in a way that isn't re-traumatizing, and also in a way that promotes safety and trust as well between the youth and the interviewer or the practitioner. We're going to look at some different techniques for screening, and then a few different frameworks that are out there for assessment. Here's some suggested readings. So let's start out by defining what motivational interviewing means. So motivational interviewing is a collaborative, goal-oriented style of communication with particular attention to the language of change. It is designed to strengthen personal motivation for and commitment to a specific goal by eliciting and exploring the person's own reasons for change within an atmosphere of acceptance and compassion. So again, this goes back to a lot of the principles that we've been talking through with trauma-informed care, which is that the individual and the client or the youth has to have ownership over their treatment and their recovery process. So we constantly need to be engaging the youth in understanding what their goals are, setting treatment goals, developing and designing programs that are most useful for them, because they need to know and they need to have ownership of the reasons why they're in a particular program and the reasons why they want to get better, want to recover. So here are some core skills of motivational interviewing. So starting out with open questions. So not just jumping deep, doing a deep dive into asking questions about how were you exploited and in what ways were you exploited. That is definitely the wrong approach. Start out with open questions, easy questions, questions that draw out the person's experiences, their ideas, their thoughts about the world. Ask questions about what the youth already knows, like where they're from and what their family is like, what their favorite subjects in school are, for instance, who their friends are. And really importantly in motivational interviewing as well is affirming an individual's strengths and past successes. And that's often as well a common goal in treatment planning, when treatment planning and developing goals for instance, mental health or educational goals, social goals, behavioral goals. Always include at least once in a treatment planning session, identifying and creating a plan to build upon a youth's or a client's strengths. So what are your strengths and how can we build upon those strengths? Reflections are based on careful listening and trying to understand what the person is saying. So repeat what a person is saying, rephrase what they're trying to communicate in order to let them know that you're actively listening to what they're saying. You're not just a clinician writing down notes on a piece of paper. You want to know how they feel and what they're saying. And repeating and rephrasing things can be a really helpful way of doing that. And even by repeating and rephrasing and asking the youth, is this what you're trying to say? Am I getting that correctly? You can also summarize and ensure that you have a shared understanding with the youth or client. Attend to the language of change. And so steer the conversation in favor of language that supports change and recovery. So steer away from language that supports remaining in a current state or not being proactive about certain levels of change. And then finally, make sure that there's an equal level of respect and care for the information that the practitioner provides and the information that the client provides. So we never want to assume or make the client feel like the knowledge that they have, the experiences that they have, what they have to input into their treatment and recovery process is any less important than what you as the practitioner has to communicate or to provide input into. So what I really like is this framework. So you may have heard of the stages of change model. It's often used with victims of commercial sexual exploitation in their process of recovery. And so these stages of change are on the left here. So it starts with pre-contemplation, so they're not ready yet to enter into recovery. contemplation. They're getting ready to enter into the recovery stage. They're thinking about it. They're musing over it. Preparation. So actually engaging in the action of recovery. Maintenance, sustaining that action of recovery, and then sometimes relapse. So maybe not fully meeting our goals, maybe relapsing into behaviors that aren't healthy, and we can sometimes rephrase that to be learning. So learning, still engaging in a continual process of learning and recovery. And so what the study has done is paired those stages of change in the recovery process to various things that practitioners can do, not only in the context of motivational interviewing, but really in the context of engaging with a client on a day-to-day basis. So how practitioners can engage with a client in that particular stage. And so in pre-contemplation, when they're not ready to engage in recovery yet, the practitioner can raise doubt and increase the patient's perception of the risks and problems with their current behavior, as well as provide harm reduction strategies. And so often in this phase, the practitioner will be focused on providing psychoeducation to clients, explaining that the behaviors that they're currently engaged in are harmful for whatever reason, and especially for CSEC youth, helping youth understand that CSEC behaviors are harmful, they're not healthy, they are exploitative behaviors, and they're being exploited in various ways. And so really educating the youth in a trauma-informed manner, in an evidence-based manner, and in a way that that allows the youth to grow at their natural pace, to providing information in a way that works with their current developmental stage and with their current stage of recovery as well. Then in contemplation, help the client weigh up the pros and cons of recovery by looking at different alternatives. So what are some paths forward? What are the alternatives? Where can we go from here? What are our options? Identify reasons for change and the risks of not changing. So what if we have one alternative, which is remaining in the current state? What are the risks of that? And then our other alternative, or maybe one of many alternatives, is to recover in a specific way. And why might we want to do that? What are the reasons why we might want to rise above and beyond our current state? And then also increase the patient's confidence in their ability to change. So encourage them, encourage them with other similar stories, with the evidence, and providing, again, psychoeducation about what can happen through a recovery process. Preparation, so actually acting in recovery, helping to set really clear goals is very important. And it's also an important part of treatment planning, which is actually our next session. So setting really clear, achievable goals with the youth. And it's recommended to set both short and long-term goals, but especially short-term goals, because setting and achieving those goals are huge in building confidence and helping the youth to understand that they can reach goals that they set for themselves. And so once they reach a number of smaller goals, then they're able at some point to set and reach larger and longer term goals. So help the client or the youth to develop a realistic plan for making change and to take steps towards that change. Maintenance, so how do we sustain change over time? So depending on the youth and the individual, there are going to be a variety of factors in the recovery, and a variety of different interventions that can help the youth stick with it and keep working towards their goals. And then finally, relapse. So help the youth understand that if they make a mistake or if they go backwards, that's not the end of the road. It's a process of learning. It's understandable. They're valuable. They're smart. There's nothing about who they are that doesn't enable them to keep moving forward. So I think that pairing of different tasks, different practitioner tasks with the stage of change is really useful. And it can also be useful when working with particular youth and making a chart for each specific youth that you might be working with. And so in our facilities for youth who've been commercially sexually exploited, our mental health teams identify what stage in the stages of change model each youth is in. And then once that can be identified and understood, we can then develop interventions to work with that youth in that stage that they're in. And so understanding where youth is and making a particular plan for each youth in whatever stage that they're in can really help understand how to then shape and design interventions. And like this study shows, it can help us understand how better to interact with youth in that stage. Because say, for instance, a youth is in pre-contemplation, so they're not at all ready to think about recovery or engaging in a program or services or talking with a therapist. They don't want anything to do with that process, right? And so if they're in pre-contemplation and we jump all the way to setting goals, right, it probably, well, it might be really hard for that youth to engage in setting goals. If they're not at all in the mindset of wanting to engage in recovery at all, setting goals sounds futile to them. They don't think that maybe that would be even useful to them at all. But it's in that pre-contemplation stage that we want to just begin by helping them understand that the behaviors that they currently display are harmful. Okay. So we're going to move on to screening. So screening and assessment are two slightly different things. Screening refers more to identifying youth who have been victimized, and assessment refers more to understanding the current state of an individual within the context of them being exploited. And so assessment really is looking at physical, social, educational, psychological states or characteristics or issues or problems that an individual portrays. Screening is more so suited towards practitioners, including healthcare professionals, doctors, law enforcement, people who work in foster care, people who work in childcare and human trafficking, helping to determine whether an individual is being exploited or not. And so there are two kind of types of screening tools that you'll find out there. The first type is more of a form that a practitioner might use themselves. So not necessarily a form that they would work through with a youth, but a form that provides a set of check marks or categories to determine whether or not a youth has been exploited. And the practitioner might use a variety of sources to fill out that form or tool, including conversations with youth, but they might also use information from a placing agency or document review to fill out that form. And the second type of screening tool is actually questions that have been laid out for a practitioner to ask a youth in the style of an interview or a conversation with a youth. So the first type is more a tool that the practitioner uses. And the second type is actual guidance, actually pre-formulated questions that one can ask a youth. So we're going to look at an example of each kind of screening tool. And the examples that we're looking at are all evidence-based, validated tools that have been used with CSEC youth. So I would highly recommend, if you work with this population or you work with youth who might be in this population, using these specific tools that we're looking at today is a great option. And so an example of a type 1 screening tool is the West Coast Children's Clinic CSE-IT tool, and that stands for Commercial Sexual Exploitation Identification Tool. And so this tool is organized into 8 key indicators. So again, this tool is not meant to be used in an interview style with a practitioner or youth. It's meant to be used individually by a clinician or a practitioner. And information can be sourced from various data points. So potentially by interviewing the youth, but also potentially by obtaining information from a caregiver, other assessments, previous assessments that have been done, looking at the youth's clinical files, etc. And so this tool is organized into 8 different key indicators. So it looks at housing and caregiving, prior abuse or trauma, physical health and appearance, environment and exposure, relationships and personal belongings, signs of current trauma, coercion, and exploitation. So I've listed some of the key indicators here that they use on the form. And again, I would highly recommend looking this up on your own time. So under housing and caregiving, they look at whether the youth runs away or frequently leaves their residence, whether they experience unstable housing or periods of homelessness, whether they rely on emergency or temporary resources to meet basic needs, whether their parent or their caregiver is able to provide supervision, school attendance, and even prior involvement with the child welfare system. The second is looking at prior abuse or trauma. So whether the youth has been previously abused sexually, physically, emotionally, or whether they've witnessed abuse of any kind. Thirdly, looking at the individual's physical health and appearance. So do they have significant changes in their appearance? Do they show signs of physical trauma or tattooing or branding? And that's one specifically to look out for in CSEC. As well as whether the youth has repeatedly gotten treatment or testing for pregnancy or STIs, as well as looking at sleep and other health problems, substance abuse, etc. 4, looking at environment and exposure. So looking at whether the youth engages in different sexual activities, whether they use language involved in exploitation, whether they're connected to people who are exploited or to exploiters, whether they are bullied or targeted about exploitation, as well as if they're affiliated with gangs. That can be a huge, huge risk factor. Relationships and personal belongings. Does the youth have unhealthy, inappropriate, or romantic relationships with someone older or an adult? And so again, the reason, thinking about this tool, the reason why you wouldn't really use this tool, or at least some questions in this tool directly with a youth, is because probably wouldn't be a good idea to ask a youth directly, have you been commercially sexually exploited? And the youth probably will say, no, I haven't. And so that's, just keep in mind that the reason why this form is really to be used individually by a practitioner is for them just to note internally or privately whether they have whether they show these specific indicators. Do they meet with contacts they develop over the internet? Do they have explicit photos either on their phone or on the internet? Do they have unexplained money or credit cards? Do they have signs of current trauma? So do they appear on edge? Do they have a high level of distress? Do they engage in a lot of risk-taking behaviors? Do they show other signs of PTSD or somatic symptoms? Is there evidence of coercion? So do they have a controlling partner or a caregiver? Do they receive threats from friends or family members or other caregivers? Do they give vague or misleading information about where they're from or who they're in a relationship with? Exploitation. Do they exchange sex for money or material goods for either themselves or someone else? And so that's, to sum up, that's an example of a type 1 screening tool, which is a tool that is used by a practitioner to understand whether a youth has been exploited. And again, that tool is primarily to be used just by filling in the practitioner themselves. And so this type 2 example is a really great example for developing questions that you might directly want to ask a youth when interviewing them. So again, after establishing rapport with the youth, after choosing a safe space, after letting the youth know about who you are and your goals, you can then go on to asking them questions that can help you understand or even maybe give you clues about whether they might be exploited or whether they've previously been exploited. And so one example of this kind of tool we get from the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, which is a function of Polaris Project. And so this center runs the national hotline, the anti-human trafficking hotline in the United States. And so the questions that they've developed are pretty standard questions that can be used in a variety of different types of exploitative situations to understand whether a person has been exploited. And so this tool provides some tips for screening. So they advise that you want to conduct a screening in a comfortable and safe environment. Be relaxed and welcoming in your body language and use empathetic listening. Maintain really good eye contact and really importantly, explain who you are and what you're doing. Explain why you're asking the individual questions and also be really clear about what you can provide and what your agency can provide. And you also might want to explain too that you care about the individual situation and that you've worked with other individuals who have been in their same situation as well. So they're not alone, and you have experience. Hopefully, you have experience in working with similar people. They also suggest that again, engaging in more casual conversation in the beginning to open up rapport and trust. And And you can also be conscious of the language that you use when speaking with a potential victim of trafficking. Um, so if you're talking with a youth, for instance, who talks about their boyfriend, probably not a good idea would be to counter their response with a question about their pimp or exploiter. Um, because right away that youth is going to be like, whoa, my boyfriend isn't my pimp. What are you talking about? We have a great relationship. Even though you know or you suspect that that might not be true, you don't want to enforce different language or different terms upon that conversation, because it gives rise to a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. What you also don't want to do is to support necessarily the language that a youth might be using. So what you also don't want to do is then follow up by asking about their boyfriend. What you can do is ask about the individual or him, right? But you wouldn't want to support their categorization, but you also wouldn't want to enforce your own, if that makes sense. It's recommended to conduct a screening in the individual's native language. It's just kind of common sense, but especially for if you're working with a specific individual who whose native language isn't your own, find an interpreter or arrange for someone else to do the screening, because again, that just enables a higher level of comfort and trust. It's also really important to remember that probably the youth you're working with has been trained and conditioned not to trust law enforcement or service providers, even other adults. And so it's quite possible that that youth will not want to disclose information to you. And you have to be really patient and understand that that is really likely something that they're working through. And then finally, be aware that planned stories are very common. So it's highly possible, it's very common actually with CSEC for exploiters and pimps to give them a rehearsed story to tell about where they've been, where they've gone to school, who they live with, etc. And it's important to be aware that those kind of stories are very common. So don't necessarily take what the youth, if a story sounds really planned or pre-rehearsed, that story may not necessarily be true. It's important though not to express distrust in the youth. We always want to, in order for the youth to trust us, we have to first trust the youth. So it's important not to display any signs or express distrust in what the youth is saying. So for instance, not to say, well, that doesn't sound right because you just told me this other thing and that doesn't work out with what you're saying now. Or even asking them, is that something that someone else told you to say? Necessarily, although sometimes that might be appropriate. But it's best to be patient and keep working with the youth and help them feel as safe as possible, so that they can tell you exactly about the needs that they have and the situation that they've been in. So they recommend also starting with a safety check, and I really like this. So they say some questions that you can ask: is it safe for you to talk with me right now? How safe do you feel? Are there times when you don't feel safe? Do you feel like you're in any kind of danger while speaking with me at this location? And finally, is there anything that would help you feel safer while we talk? And so the National Human Trafficking Resource Center has put together a list of questions that are related to different kinds of exploitation. And so they have different lists for labor trafficking, for sex trafficking, for domestic servitude, etc. So we're just going to go through a few of those lists. And again, I would really recommend looking up their resources, because they have very comprehensive resources out there. So when thinking about coercion, asking the individual, do you ever feel pressured to do something that you didn't want to do or felt uncomfortable doing? So again, we're not asking, have you been exploited or have you been trafficked, right? But have you ever feel pressured to do something? What were your expectations of what would happen if you left this person or situation, or if you didn't do what this person told you to do? Did anyone ever take your legal identification papers or threaten you? Asking questions about force. Has anyone ever controlled or monitored your work or your actions? Was your communication or your movement or what you did ever restricted or monitored? Were you allowed access to medical care or other social or legal services? Have you ever been allowed to leave the place that you were living or working? And was your movement outside of that place monitored? What did you think would happen if you left the situation? Some questions specific to sex trafficking. Has anyone pressured you to engage in sexual acts against your will? Um, has anyone forced you to engage in commercial sex acts through online websites or through other means like informal arrangements or strip clubs, for instance? Some questions to do specifically with labor trafficking. How did you feel about where you worked? Did you feel that you were paid fairly? What were your working hours? What happened if you worked fewer hours or took breaks? Were you punished, for instance? Did anyone ever threaten you? Where did you live? And was that housing controlled, etc.? And so this is another example of a type 2 screening tool. And this tool, unlike the National Human Trafficking Center, which has been created for a broad range of situations, this tool is specifically looking at CSEC, and it has much shorter set of questions, but can be really good to use and to look at if you highly suspect that the youth you're working with is a survivor of commercial sexual exploitation. And so the questions that they put together, and this is from the District of Columbia Courts in 2015, and so they call this the STAR screening tool for CSEC. So the question starts out with, where were you staying last night? Are you living with anyone, and what is your relationship to them? So just really simple questions, right? Like, where do you live? Who do you live with? Have you ever been placed in a foster care or group home? And have you ever run away? How long do you usually stay away? Are you dating anyone? And if so, how old are they? What are some things you bought for yourself over the past 2 months and who paid for it? What names have you used other than your own? Do you have any tattoos? And if so, do they have special meaning? Is there evidence of abuse? Are there any red flag charges and records? So for instance, status offenses or runaways. And are there any charges of solicitation or prostitution? And so really simple list, really small. In my opinion, this list is highly effective for law enforcement, for instance, because it's just really simple questions, nothing medical, nothing clinical, just simply, are we potentially going to want to refer this youth to services for CSEC youth? Okay, so that's just going through some examples of screening tools. And again, there are lots of screening tools out there. When choosing a screening tool, I would either use one of those ones that we just talked about, or really think through how questions are phrased and what the questions are asking. Are the questions very direct and harsh? Are they judgmental? Are they assuming about what a youth does or where a youth has been? Or are questions inviting? Are they welcoming? And are they allowing the practitioner or the interviewer to genuinely get to know the youth and their experiences, but again, to ask specific questions that would help you understand whether they've been exploited and how they've been exploited. And so moving on to assessment. So unlike screening, which is understanding whether a person has been exploited, assessment looks at the specific symptoms and understanding the range of symptoms and issues and outcomes of exploitation that an individual portrays on a mental health level, as well as on a physical level and emotional level. So understanding the range of symptoms and what they are, and then what we can do about them. So especially for residential programs, but also for any kind of childcare program, you want to conduct initial assessments to gather just information about that individual when they're coming into your program. And that's important not only for understanding what services that individual needs, but also for evaluation. So if you can understand how symptoms have changed over time in relation to when they first arrived at your program, that's really good practice for continuous quality improvement. And so an assessment should measure a youth's mental, emotional, and behavioral health. It can measure or include clinical history, as well as relevant cultural issues in history. It should definitely include the youth's thoughts on the use of de-escalation techniques. And so this is a really important point that is often overlooked in assessments, but it's important for practitioners and clinicians to ask the youth about how they want staff and service providers to engage with them when they're escalated. Um, so this is also important in treatment planning as well, but specifically directly ask the youth, how do you want us to help you? Not just assuming based on the youth's issues and symptoms and history, not just creating a set of interventions from our side as the practitioner side, but asking them, how do you want us to interact with you? Do they have a history of aggressiveness? And then as well, does the youth have ideas about different techniques or tools that may help them to control their behavior? It can also include information about pre-existing medical conditions or disabilities, as well as the history of trauma that youth has or may have experienced. So not only do you want to do an initial assessment, but you want to make sure that you're doing ongoing assessments. And again, that's important not only for understanding what services that the youth needs, and not only for understanding what point the youth is in the recovery, but also for evaluation. So understanding how a youth changes and the effectiveness of different interventions and programs that you're using. It's also important to ensure that assessments are conducted by mental health professionals. That's really important and something that is very best practice. And so you want to do ongoing assessments to track changes in the presence, frequency, and intensity of symptoms, to learn the relationships among the youth's trauma presenting psychological symptoms and substance abuse, to then adjust treatment plans as needed, and also to select prevention strategies to avoid more pervasive traumatic stress symptoms. So we want to obviously identify what the youth is experiencing, but as we do that over time, we can then prevent the further evolution of those symptoms and issues. And so developing prevention strategies is something that can be really aided by assessment, because when we assess, especially on an ongoing basis, we know about how the youth is progressing and what they're currently dealing with. And so one recommendation is meet with youth each quarter. And that really depends on the program. If you're working with CSEC youth, meet with them at least every week, if not every day, to look at the successes and difficulties that they've experienced, evaluated their progress towards their goals, and discuss any possible changes that might be needed to the youth treatment plan. So again, I would really go for meet with the youth as much as you can, as much capacity that you have to work one-on-one with the youth and to identify their progress and to look at what they need and their needs and how well they're reacting to services. Do that as much as you can, at least every week. And again, focus on strengths. Identify what strengths the youth has. Are they good at English? Are they good at soccer? Do they really enjoy going shopping? Do they really enjoy going on hikes? Are they really good at interacting with people? Are they good at cooking? Do they enjoy cooking? What are the strengths of that youth? And what are their strengths specifically in the context of recovery? Are there specific treatments that they respond well to? Are there certain mindfulness activities that they can do really well? Always focus and identify on the strengths and talk with the youth about how they can use those strengths or build up those strengths to further continual progress. So these are some tips for conducting assessments, and these are actually similar to tips in conducting screenings. Really, ensuring safety. So meet in a space that's private, definitely private, and is quiet. Make sure that there's no way that other people can sort of overhear the conversation. And it's important too to explain why the assessment is taking place. So just like when you're doing a screening, explain who you are if you're not known by the youth already. Explain what the assessment is and the purpose of the assessment. It's also important to explain how the data of the assessment is going to be used, because the youth that we're working with are not unaware. They're not unaware that they're giving you really personal information. And so tell the youth exactly the data that you're collecting and how that data will be used and where it will be stored. So, this data is stored in an electronic health record system. It is accessed only by the mental health staff of this facility. What that means is that we're keeping your information confidential from anyone who doesn't need to know. So your information is only being seen by those on a need-to-need basis, which is the mental health team, for instance. Understand also the youth's potential mindset during an assessment. So they might be frightened of threats if they divulge certain information. And also understand again that it might take several sessions to establish trust and be patient with that. Also try to refrain from expressing strong reactions and to avoid judgmental or accusatory language. Um, Also, as stated before, understand that certain responses may be scripted and use an interpreter if needed. All right, so there are lots of different tools and frameworks for assessment. And so we've listed some of them here. Um, all the ones that we've listed here are evidence-based assessment tools, and a lot of different assessment tools can be or have been shaped for youth of specific age ranges, youth of specific backgrounds, etc. And so we're going to look at these and then more in depth at one in particular. And so there's the adolescent clinical sexual behavior inventory. This is more so geared towards understanding sex-related behaviors and understanding whether an intervention might be necessary. We have the adolescent coping orientation for problem experiences, ACOPE. This is a 54-item self-report questionnaire used to identify coping strategies. So what are the different coping mechanisms that youth use? There is the Beck Anxiety Inventory. So list of questions that helps us to understand the level of anxiety, both in adults and in adolescents. There's the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths, CANS. This is, at the present moment, one of the most well-known. It's highly well-regarded and validated. And so the CANS primarily measures functioning in the context of traumatic experience and traumatic stress symptoms. And so CANS, we're going to look at CANS a little bit deeper compared to the other assessment tools, just because CANS right now is regarded as sort of the gold standard in assessment, especially for CSEC. And so they look at assessment over various domains. So the first domain that they look at is behavioral and emotional needs. So they ask questions around trying to understand the youth's level of anxiety and depression, their conduct, their anger control. The second domain is caregiver needs and resources. So understanding the level of involvement that the youth has with their care, the social resources that they have, their residential stability, their mental health and substance abuse, etc. Thirdly, understanding cultural factors. So understanding the youth's language, their traditions and rituals, their cultural stress. And while 3 sounds slightly vague and perhaps unclinical, it's actually really important in setting a foundation in a context for which treatment and service takes place. The fourth domain is life function. So looking at school attendance and achievement, their decision-making, their sexual development, their sleep, where they live, who their family is, how their family functions, etc. Number 5, the fifth domain is looking at risk behaviors. So whether the youth is specifically at risk for certain really harmful behaviors like running away, suicide, self-harm. And then looking at strengths. So what are the strengths of this individual youth? And again, a really important thing to assess, both initially and on an ongoing basis, looking at, in order to look at, for instance, how a youth's strengths has changed over the course of treatment or involvement in a program. So looking at strengths that they have in their cultural identity, in their resilience, in their resourcefulness, in their talents and their interests. And then they have various, what they call individual assessment domains. So looking at traumatic and adverse childhood experiences, trauma, stress, symptoms, substance use disorders, violence, emotional behavioral risks, and resiliency factors, developmental needs, juvenile justice, and runaway. And so we won't go into all of these in depth. But again, if you want to look more in depth at CANS, I would recommend it because it is a really good assessment tool. Other assessment tools, we have the Child Report of Post-Traumatic Symptoms, or CROPS, assesses a broad range of post-traumatic symptoms. Child Trauma Screening Questionnaire, again, identifying symptoms in children at risk of developing PTSD. Childhood Trauma Questionnaire, similar Children's Hope Scale, which looks at understanding children's dispositional hope. It's a very interesting and also related to our previous lecture on aspirational self-alterity. But looking at the goals that children have and how goals can be understood by agency and pathways. So interesting assessment tool. And then finally listed here is the trauma symptom checklist for children, TSCC. So looking at the behavioral and psychological symptoms and how psychological symptoms manifest, and understanding what those symptoms are and how they're related potentially to trauma. All right, so on that note, that is the end. Does anyone have any questions? I'm gonna stop sharing my screen here. Oh wait, I already did. So I have a little bit just kind of thrown different frameworks and questions at you, but hopefully it gives you an idea of what tools are out there and which tools are really well regarded, and then how also to conduct interviews in a really good and healthy way, and what to expect from those interviews. So yeah, if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to voice them now before we leave.
Ma'am, I have one question.
Yeah.
It is about the part of assessment, and the assessment should measure, I think, the youth thoughts on the issue of de-escalation techniques. So
Yeah.
I'm not used to de-escalation techniques. So would you like to explain more about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So de-escalation techniques refer to interventions or actions that a practitioner can take with a youth when they're quote unquote escalated. So when they appear to be violent, if they're, for instance, wanting to run away, or if they're acting out, if they're getting really angry, if they're clearly really agitated. So if youth is escalated, what can a practitioner do in that situation to help the youth sort of calm down and breathe and know that they're safe? And so there are lots of different types of de-escalation techniques. Some are centered around sort of helping the youth calm down. So for instance, placing them in a safe room, providing them with a safe packet of things like a blanket or a ball, using really tactile things like sand or toys to start using your hands and feeling your body, and sort of getting yourself outside of your mind, returning the youth to the present, even looking around the room and noticing things in the room, asking the youth what they see, what they can touch, what they can smell, so activities that bring them back into the present. Sometimes de-escalation techniques can sort of bring or try to distract a youth from where they are. So distracting them with a different activity, or for instance, we work with a clinician in the States who really likes to, talk to the youth and say, okay, we're going to think about all this in a second, but right now let's just go on a walk. Let's just walk outside, smell fresh air, and kind of distract ourselves from whatever's going on in the present moment. And so there are a variety of different de-escalation techniques, but the key point there was that we always want to ask the youth about how we want to interact with them. So for instance, if I had a history of anger, right? If I had a hard time managing and controlling my anger, I could tell my caregiver, look, when I get angry, I don't want you to talk to me. I just want you to let me be. I want you to let me be by myself. And that lets the caregiver know that those are the things that I want them to do when I feel escalated or angry. So it's really just helping the practitioner understand what the youth wants in that moment, so that when they are really escalated and when when they have maybe a lot of thoughts going on that they're trying to sort through. When they're in an escalated state, what the practitioner can respond with is something that the youth likes, or at least something that the youth has said that they like or has worked in the past for them. I see the hand clap. Yeah, any other questions? That was a really good question, by the way. And it's also going to be something that we'll talk just briefly about in the next session too, when looking at treatment planning. So when we treatment plan, we want to plan for the treatment of a youth. And so understanding the youth's prior directives about de-escalation, for instance, or other forms of intervention is an important part of treatment planning as well. Great. Well, thank you all for joining, and I'll see you next week on Tuesday. Bye.